I've said it before and I'll say it again. I love Jimmy Olsen. Starting life as a no-name background character in the early days of superhero comics, Jimmy grew into the embodiment of the Silver Age and its ability to push comics into the weird, wacky, and wonderful. Again, I'm not overstating this. Jimmy Olsen and his contemporaries played a pivotal role in making comics what they are today. But sadly, even the shining optimism of the Silver Age can fade over time, and nobody knows that better than Jimmy. By 2010, DC Comics had started a major pivot in tone and direction. There were still lighter, sillier comics out there, but the success of stories like 52 and 1 Year Later led to a general darkening of the publisher's output, as well as an increased focus on tentpole characters. And with the company-wide relaunch of the New 52 on the horizon, it was looking like Jimmy and his pals would be shelved. Someone had to make their case, and luckily, someone did. In 2010, writer Nick Spencer and artist R.B. Silva debuted Jimmy Olsen in the pages of Action Comics, with the goal of re-establishing Superman's pal as a major character in the DC universe. Did it work? Well, kinda. While DC's dark and gritty pivot to the New 52 was set in stone, Spencer and Silva's mini was instrumental in Jimmy's slow but steady resurgence, honoring the character's strange history, laying the groundwork for later reinventions, and even surviving the cancellation of DC's second feature initiative to return as a full comic. And sure, it doesn't have the titanic stakes or name brand recognition of what DC would continue to tout over the New 52, but it's still a brilliant celebration of Jimmy Olsen, the Silver Age comics that made him famous, and how even after all these years, they're still so cool. Nowadays, when we talk about the Silver Age, there's one word that keeps popping up. Originally a term tied to queer subculture, something that Grant Morrison would pay tribute to in their take on Jimmy, camp in comics eventually grew into a broader term used to define the over-the-top antics of the 50s and 60s. However, as time rolled on, comics began to lean into more self-serious takes on their characters, often treating the Silver Age as something to be ignored or mocked. Even Jimmy wasn't immune to this, having most of his history wiped away through Crisis on Infinite Earths and falling back into his old role of cub reporter and photographer. While he still had a presence in the DC universe, Jimmy Olsen felt more like a relic to be laughed at than a character who could carry his own story, a perpetual sidekick to his more famous pal. That is, until 2010. Thanks to the Superman arc New Krypton, sister series Action Comics gave the spotlight to Superman's many supporting characters, each undergoing their own journey as Superman worked to restore his homeworld. Spencer, who is mostly known for his indie work on Forgetless, Shuttertown, and Morning Glories, also had a massive love for Jimmy and his history, and when approached by editor Will Moss, immediately began pitching a revamped take on Jimmy's Silver Age adventures.
I grew up on a pretty steady diet of Superman's pal back issues, so I certainly wanted to do something that honored the spirit of those stories, but in a way that felt new and fresh,
Spencer would reflect.
I didn't want to just rehash Jimmy becoming Turtle Boy over and over or whatever, but I wanted to tell some stories that if you sat down and read those old issues, then you read mine, you could feel the respect and admiration for what's come before it. There's so much going on behind the panels in those Silver Age books, and it's fun to go back and see what makes them tick and then apply that in a modern setting. To be a part of that history and that tradition is a very big deal to me.
Spencer's snappier, modern take on Jimmy and his world was given life through another then up-and-comer, R.B. Silva. The artist, who would gain fame for his later work on House of X and Powers of 10, has the perfect sci-fi sensibilities to sell this take on the DCU. With a fluid style that accommodates the exaggerated geometry of Jack Kirby, the softer features of Kurt Swan, and a number of creative layouts that tap into the character's roots in sci-fi and romance. Coupled with softer, fluid inks from DYM, a more muted color palette by Dave McCaig, and immersive lettering effects by Rob Lee, Silva's images craft a take on Jimmy that's lovingly self-aware of its absurdity. Drama can easily swing into comedy, and vice versa, all without breaking the book's larger tone. It's definitely the same Metropolis, but with an added layer of realism that makes the chaos of Jimmy's life really pop, which is kinda the whole point of the story.
Things like this didn't used to be a problem for me. Things used to be fun. Like that time I was a genie. Good stuff. These days, not so much.
Whereas previous stories used Jimmy's role as Superman's pal to lean into escapist adventures, with the character often stumbling into the weirder corners of his friend's world, Spencer's story begins with Jimmy thrown out of Superman's shadow, and kinda unsure of what to do with himself. In a complete inversion of All-Star Superman's confident chameleon, Spencer's Jimmy is a perpetual sidekick who's never had to strike out on his own, something that ultimately drives his girlfriend Chloe Sullivan away. And while it initially feels like business as usual, evil execs, partying aliens, you know the stuff, Jimmy's new awareness of his issues ends up recoloring his many adventures.
I really wanted to take Jimmy out of his comfort zones, introduce him to new people, lead him to his adventures in a very different way,
states Spencer.
Because when I looked at most of the Jimmy stories from the last few decades, I saw them sort of circling what had come before, remaking a lot of the Weisinger era or Kirby run ideas, and it's all great, but the problem is it becomes a little too familiar. In Jimmy's case, it's really hard to directly revisit that stuff without losing a lot of that insanity and charm that those old stories had. So rather than do that, I want to try introducing some fresh faces, give Jimmy something of a supporting cast of his own, but again, to do it in a way that it feels like a spiritual successor to those classic comics.
Something often forgotten is that despite the insane history of stuff he's gone through, Jimmy's still just a kid in the process of forming his own identity. And it's that journey that the writer makes the bedrock of his story, as Jimmy struggles to find his own sense of self in the absence of his role model / get-out-of-jail-free card. While each encounter acts as a remix of classic Silver Age tropes, complete with callbacks to Jimmy's adventures, Spencer cleverly uses a number of Superman parallels to subvert Jimmy's agency. An attempt to thwart an alien invasion turns into an embarrassingly sloppy bar crawl. Chloe gets close to Jimmy's personal Lex Luthor, and thanks to his relationship with a fourth-dimensional sorceress, he ends up in a fantasy where he literally becomes Superman. Or at least co-Superman. The commentary here is pretty obvious. The people around Jimmy can only see him through his connection to Superman, an attitude that he's come to see in himself. He hasn't changed all this time because he's never really had to do it. And while I'd argue hero worship is something we all experience, Spencer's story explores how it can literally subsume your whole identity, with Jimmy's role as Superman's pal keeping him in a stage of arrested development. No, not that one. But while his immaturity is what led to his identity crisis, no, not that one. It's the acknowledgement of these shortcomings and his own feelings that finally let Jimmy break free from his role model's shadow, rejecting his Superman fantasies and reclaiming bits of his own weird history to win Chloe back. Not only is the series the perfect culmination of Jimmy as a character, it's also a brilliant use of his role as an audience surrogate, with his identity as a lifelong second stringer kicking off a coming-of-age story decades in the making. There will always be people we look up to or emulate in some way, but we all have it in ourselves to grow into something truly incredible. Sometimes, it's just a question of accepting the adventure that's been in front of you all along. In a typically Olsen manner, Spencer and Silva's miniseries didn't have the same impact as its contemporaries. It did, however, prove instrumental for the character and the kinds of stories he embodied. The backup was well received by the publisher and fans, so much so that it even survived the cancellation of DC's second features through a reprinted collection. But unfortunately, Spencer's efforts to revive the appeal of Jimmy in the Silver Age couldn't stop what was already in the works. DC's New 52 would ultimately move forward, ushering in an era of darker, grittier titles focused on its biggest names, while pushing lesser knowns like Jimmy Olsen back into the role of supporting characters. Not surprisingly, Spencer would leave for Marvel Comics shortly after completing the series, where he would helm Superior Foes of Spider-Man, which rules, as well as bigger properties like Spider-Man and Captain America. But he would continue to talk about his love for Jimmy Olsen, as well as the character's importance to comics at large.
I think sadly this will be it, but I'm very satisfied with what we were able to do,
reflects Spencer.
We told a story that I hope gets Jimmy back to the core of what he is, and what he means to the DC universe. That's a huge part of his charm, that he's this normal, non-powered guy, but his exploits span pretty much every possible genre out there. There are Jimmy Olsen pirate stories, Jimmy Olsen werewolf stories, you name it. He just gets thrown into these absurd, inconceivable situations by virtue of his own thirst for excitement. It's one of those things where I could do another, but I'd just be as happy to see other writers take it from here.
While it didn't exactly turn the tide of the New 52, Spencer's miniseries was still incredibly impactful for the character and emblematic of the publisher's eventual return to form. Fans would eventually grow tired of the New 52's self-seriousness, prompting a restoration through its Rebirth initiative in 2016. Jimmy himself would return to prominence in the Superman books, even going on to head an Eisner Award-winning revival of his series under Matt Fraction and Steve Lieber. He'd also get a handful of appearances in film and TV, some fun and faithful to his character, others, well, you get where I'm going. And even though later iterations would walk Jimmy back into his supporting role, they would continue to build on Spencer's take for the character, showing how we can take inspiration from our heroes while staying true to who we are. As I dig deeper into the history of comics, I find myself more appreciative of the many books and ideas that quietly help to change things for these stories. Spencer's series might not be Jimmy's most famous book, but in the shadow of what was to come, it still feels like a triumphant celebration of all things silly and weird, and shows that over 7 decades later, there's still plenty of life in Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen. Happy Jimmyuary everyone, and thanks for checking out my first video of the new year. I'll admit, for whatever reason, I've never put Nick Spencer's take on Jimmy Olsen among the character's biggest stories, but it's really fascinating looking at it as an artifact from when DC was about to completely change as a company. I'd also say it's a very quietly important book, one of the first in years to say Jimmy's still a character who can carry his own series. And as the #1 Fraction Lieber series fan, I'll always be thankful to it for that. If you like this video, please feel free to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Every little bit helps the channel out a lot. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Carol Ann Brenneman, The Comics Cave, Dom DeFelice, Kirk Ireland, and my patrons, who are helping me to grow this channel and continue doing what I love, and hopefully what you love too. Until next time, stay safe, stay healthy, and have a joyous Jimmyuary.